I said the wrong name at my wedding and everyone laughed, but the person whose name I said stood up and left, and that's when I realized it wasn't a mistake. I remember the moment clearly because time slowed in a way it never had before. I was standing at the altar in a dress that felt heavier than I expected. The music had faded into a soft background hum, and every face I loved was turned toward me, waiting, smiling, believing this was the happiest moment of my life. And when the officiant asked me to repeat my vows, my hands were shaking, but I told myself it was normal because everyone shakes on their wedding day. So I took a breath and looked at the man in front of me, the man I was supposed to marry, the man everyone believed I loved completely, and I began to speak. I promised love and loyalty and patience, words I had practiced in front of mirrors and whispered alone at night, and then I reached the part where I was supposed to say his name, and without thinking, without pausing, without realizing what I was doing, another name left my mouth, clear and confident and devastating, the name of my best friend. There was a beat of silence, just one, before the laughter began, soft at first, then spreading like relief through the crowd. People smiled and shook their heads the way you do when nerves get the best of someone, and I laughed too because it felt easier than understanding what had just happened, and the officiant chuckled and gently corrected me, and my groom squeezed my hands with an amused smile, and for a moment it seemed like the world had agreed to forgive me instantly. But I felt it before I saw it, the shift. I looked to my left where my best friend had been standing moments ago, close enough to meet my eyes when I was nervous, close enough to ground me, and he wasn't there anymore. His seat was empty and my chest tightened as if something essential had been pulled away. And while everyone adjusted and moved forward and pretended nothing mattered, I stood there finishing vows that suddenly felt unfamiliar, like I was reciting someone else's promises with my voice. The ceremony ended and people clapped and hugged me and told me how beautiful everything was, and I searched every corner for him expecting an explanation, a joke, a look that said it was fine, but he never came back. And when I asked where he was, people shrugged and said he probably needed air, and I nodded, like that made sense even though my heart was racing. That night, after the dress was folded and the guests were gone and the room was quiet, I stared at the ceiling, wondering how a name could slip out so easily and whether it was a mistake or something my heart had been waiting years to say out loud. Do you think saying the wrong name at the altar can ever be just nerves? The days after the wedding passed in a blur that felt strangely disconnected from my body, as if I were watching someone else live my life from a distance. Because everyone kept talking about how perfect everything had been, and how funny my little slip was, and how it would be a story we laughed about for years. Yet every time someone mentioned it, my stomach tightened instead of easing, and I smiled because that was easier than explaining the quiet dread growing inside me, and my husband noticed the shift before I did, asking gently if I was overwhelmed or tired or just adjusting, and I told him yes to all of it because none of those answers were lies, but they weren't the truth either. The truth was that my best friend hadn't called or texted or shown up with his usual concern masked as humor, and that silence felt louder than any accusation could have been, because he had always been the one constant in my life, the person who knew when to step closer and when to give space, and suddenly he was gone, without explanation. And I found myself replaying the moment at the altar again and again, trying to hear it differently, trying to convince myself the name had slipped out randomly like a muscle memory glitch. But the more I replayed it, the more deliberate it sounded, and that terrified me. I asked mutual friends if they had heard from him, and they shrugged awkwardly, saying he was busy, or needed time, or probably embarrassed. And I nodded like I accepted that explanation, even though none of it sounded like him, because embarrassment had never been something he hid behind. And late at night, when my husband slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, wondering why my first instinct wasn't guilt but grief, as if I'd lost something I hadn't realized I was holding onto. I tried calling him once, standing in the kitchen with my phone trembling in my hand, but the call went unanswered and I didn't leave a message because I didn't know what voice to use. The bride, the friend, the woman who said his name, without understanding why, and days turned into weeks, and the unanswered space between us began to feel intentional. And that was when doubt crept in, quietly asking questions I didn't want to face, like why his absence hurt more than it should, and why my chest tightened whenever I imagined never speaking to him again. I told myself love was complicated, and feelings didn't disappear the moment vows were spoken, that history takes time to fade, yet deep down, I knew this felt different. Not like letting go, but like being cut off mid-breath. And the more I tried to bury it, the more persistent it became. And I started to wonder if the mistake at the altar hadn't been the name itself, but the belief that I didn't already know what it meant. If someone disappeared after a moment like that, would you chase answers or let silence decide for you? I started noticing the past in places it had never announced itself before. Small corners of my life that suddenly felt louder now that he was gone. Like the empty chair at family dinners where he always sat even though he wasn't related to anyone, or the grocery aisle where I still reached for the brand he preferred without thinking. And these details unsettled me because they suggested a closeness I had never questioned until it was missing, and I told myself it was normal to miss a best friend, especially one who had been woven so tightly into my daily routines. But the explanation felt thin the more I repeated it. My husband noticed, too, not an accusation, but an observation. The way I paused before answering questions, the way my attention drifted when his name came up in conversation. And one evening, he asked me gently whether something had happened between us that I hadn't told him about. And the honesty in his voice made my throat tighten because there was nothing concrete to confess, yet everything inside me felt exposed. And I told him no because I'd never crossed a line and because I believed that was the same as being innocent. That night, I opened an old photo album searching for comfort in nostalgia, and instead, I found clarity I hadn't been prepared for because in nearly every milestone, he was there, not at the center, but close enough to matter. Birthdays, graduations, holidays, quiet days that never made it to social media. And in every picture, my body leaned toward him instinctively as if it had chosen him long before my mind ever considered it. And I stared at those images, trying to remember what I'd been thinking in those moments, but my mind only offered warmth, familiarity, safety. I remembered how he used to pick me up when my car broke down without complaint, how he knew when I needed distraction instead of advice, how he once stayed up all night helping me practice a presentation because I was too anxious to sleep. And none of those moments felt romantic on their own, but together they formed something deeper, something steadier than the dramatic love stories I had imagined for myself. And the realization frightened me because it meant I might have built my life on a misunderstanding of what love actually looked like. I began to question my own memories, wondering how many times I had chosen comfort over curiosity, how many times I had redirected feelings into friendship because it felt safer. And when I thought back to the man I married, I felt affection, respect, stability. But when I thought of my best friend, my chest tightened in a way that felt unmanageable. And I wondered if love had been standing beside me quietly for years while I chased something louder. The thought felt like betrayal even thinking it, so I buried it quickly, reminding myself that vows mattered and choices had consequences. Yet the more I tried to push the question away, the more it demanded to be answered. And by the end of that week, I understood something uncomfortable and undeniable, that the name I said at the altar hadn't come from nowhere. It had come from somewhere I'd been avoiding for a very long time. Can love hide in plain sight if you never give it permission to be seen? I decided to look for him not because I wanted answers, but because avoiding them had started to feel like a lie I was telling myself every morning. And I told my husband I needed space without explaining why, because I didn't yet trust my own reasons. And as I drove to the places we used to go together, I felt a strange mix of guilt and relief, like I was crossing a line that had always been there but never acknowledged. And when I finally found him, it wasn't dramatic or cinematic. He was sitting alone at a small cafe near the old library, staring at his phone like someone waiting for a message he didn't expect to receive. And when he looked up and saw me, his expression didn't harden or soften. It simply closed like a door locking quietly. I apologized first, not for saying his name, but for pretending it hadn't mattered. And he listened without interrupting, without reacting the way he always had when I needed space to speak. And when I finished, he said, "I didn't leave because you embarrassed me. I left because I finally heard what I had been pretending not to hear for years." And those words landed heavier than any accusation because they confirmed what I had only just begun to admit to myself. And I asked him why he never said anything before. And he smiled faintly and said, "Because you were always choosing something else. And I didn't want to be the reason you questioned your life." And that sentence stayed with me because it sounded like love, without demand, without urgency, without expectation. I told him I didn't know what I felt, only that something had been unspoken for too long. And he nodded, like that was enough truth for one conversation. And he told me he needed distance, not out of anger, but out of self-respect, because staying close while I figured myself out would only reopen wounds he had finally started to close. And hearing that hurt more than losing him suddenly because it meant he was choosing himself in a way I'd never learned to do. As I left, I realized something important, that love doesn't always ask for recognition. It waits patiently, hoping you will arrive on your own. And I understood then that the silence between us wasn't punishment, it was protection. And for the first time since the wedding, I stopped blaming nerves or fate or timing and accepted that my mistake had been a revelation, not an accident. And as I drove home, the weight of that understanding settled in my chest quietly and permanently. That night, I stood in front of the mirror, looking at my reflection, trying to reconcile the woman who said the wrong name with the woman who had ignored the truth for years. And I knew that uncovering what I felt would not be quick or clean. It would cost me comfort, certainty, and possibly the life I had just chosen. But for the first time since the vows, I felt honest. And honesty, even when it hurts, feels like breathing after holding your breath too long. Is it braver to stay in the life you chose or to question it when the truth finally speaks? The truth does not arrive loudly, it seeps into daily life, quietly changing the weight of ordinary moments. And after meeting him, I returned home feeling like I was carrying something fragile and dangerous inside me, because knowing something and acting on it are very different kinds of courage. And my husband noticed the change almost immediately, not in my words, but in my absence, the way my attention drifted during conversations, the way my laughter arrived a second too late. And one evening, he asked me directly if I was happy. And the simplicity of the question startled me because I had been preparing for accusations, not honesty. I wanted to say yes, because happiness had always felt like the correct answer, but instead I hesitated, and that pause said more than any confession could have, and he didn't push. He only nodded slowly like someone who had already sensed the truth approaching, and that silence between us became heavier than any argument, because it meant we were both aware something fundamental had shifted, even if neither of us knew how to name it yet. I started examining my marriage the way you examine a house for cracks after an earthquake, noticing what still stood and what had never been as solid as I believed, and I realized that what we had was built on reliability and shared plans and affection that felt safe. But safety without depth can become quiet loneliness over time. And I wondered how many times I had mistaken comfort for fulfillment, simply because it didn't demand risk. Guilt followed me everywhere, not sharp and dramatic, but dull and persistent, because I hadn't crossed a physical line, and yet emotionally, I felt disloyal for acknowledging feelings I had buried for years. And I questioned whether love discovered too late deserved to exist at all, or whether responsibility meant choosing silence forever. And every option felt like a loss. I stopped checking my phone, hoping for a message from him, because I knew he was honoring the distance he asked for. And that restraint only deepened my respect for him, because it reminded me that love without boundaries becomes sacrifice, and sacrifice without choice becomes resentment. And I had already lived that cycle without realizing it. One night, I sat alone in the living room, after my husband had gone to bed, listening to the quiet, and I finally admitted something out loud to no one but myself, that the name I said at the altar hadn't escaped accidentally. It had surfaced because part of me was tired of pretending I didn't feel what I felt, and admitting that didn't give me answers, but it gave me clarity. And clarity is dangerous, because once you have it, you are responsible for what you do next. I understood then that the years ahead would be shaped not by who I loved more, but by who I was willing to be honest with. And as I turned off the lights and walked into a bedroom that suddenly felt unfamiliar, I knew that whatever choice came next would change everything. Is emotional honesty a betrayal or a necessary step before real commitment? The confrontation I had been postponing arrived without drama on a quiet afternoon when my husband came home earlier than expected and found me sitting at the table staring at nothing. And he didn't ask what was wrong right away because he already knew something was. Instead, he sat across from me and said, "We need to talk." And the steadiness in his voice made my chest tighten because it carried neither anger nor accusation, only fatigue. I told him the truth, not all of it, but enough that I was confused that something inside me had shifted, that I was questioning feelings I thought I understood. And as I spoke, I watched his expression change, not sharply, but slowly, like someone processing loss in real time. And when I mentioned my best friend's name, he didn't interrupt or raise his voice. He only closed his eyes briefly as if confirming something he had suspected but hoped he was wrong about. He asked me if I loved him, and the question felt unfair because love is not a switch you turn off when it becomes inconvenient. So I answered honestly, saying yes, but not in the way I should at this stage of our marriage. And that answer broke something open between us because it acknowledged the truth without offering a solution. And he nodded slowly before asking the harder question, whether I loved my best friend. And my silence was answer enough. What surprised me most was not his anger, but his sadness. Because sadness suggests grief for something real. And he had every right to grieve the future he thought we were building. And he told me he didn't blame me for feelings I hadn't acted on, but he couldn't pretend they didn't matter. And hearing that made me realize how much courage it takes to face truth without rewriting it to feel better. We talked for hours, circling the same questions without answers, until exhaustion replaced emotion. And by the end of it, we both understood that nothing would be decided that day because some decisions need space to become clear. And he asked me for honesty going forward, even if it led somewhere painful. And I agreed because lying at that point would have been cruelty disguised as kindness. After he went to bed, I sat alone again. But this time the silence felt different, less suffocating, more expectant. Because I knew I was approaching a choice that would define not just who I loved, but who I respected myself enough to be. And I realized that love discovered late still carries responsibility, not entitlement, and that choosing it would require letting go of the safety I had built and accepting the consequences without resentment. As the night stretched on, I thought about my best friend, honoring distance even now, not reaching out, not complicating my already fractured world, and I understood that whatever happened next could not be driven by urgency or guilt, but by clarity, because rushing toward truth can be just as destructive as running from it. And as dawn crept in quietly, I accepted something I had been resisting for weeks, that the hardest part wasn't choosing between two men, but choosing whether to live honestly, even if it meant standing alone for a while. When honesty risks everything, is it still the right choice? I moved out 3 days later with a single suitcase and a heart that felt heavier than everything I left behind, and the quiet apartment I rented smelled like fresh paint and loneliness, which felt fitting because I needed a space that did not remember me as someone's wife or someone's almost mistake. The separation was not dramatic. No slammed doors or shouted accusations, just paperwork and careful conversations and a shared understanding that love without certainty turns into resentment if you force it to stay. And we promised each other dignity because that was the last gift we could still give. Days stretched into weeks, and my phone stayed silent except for work messages and my mother's worried check-ins. And every night I wondered if my best friend was also counting silence the way I was, measuring it like proof of restraint rather than absence of feeling. I started therapy because my thoughts had begun looping like a song that never resolves. And there I learned that naming a feeling does not obligate you to act on it, but ignoring it does not make it disappear. And that realization sat with me heavily because it meant I could not blame the wedding or the vow or the moment at the altar anymore. One evening, I ran into him unexpectedly at a bookstore of all places, both of us reaching for the same novel, and when our eyes met, the world seemed to pause, not with romance, but with recognition, and we laughed softly at the coincidence, like two people afraid to acknowledge how much the universe had been nudging us. We talked between shelves, keeping our voices low, discussing trivial things as if we were rebuilding familiarity brick by brick, and he told me he had moved cities briefly to give me space and himself clarity, and hearing that hurt and healed me at the same time because distance had been his way of loving me without demanding anything. I asked him why he never confronted me after the wedding, and he said because he needed to know if I would choose truth on my own rather than be pushed into it. And that sentence stayed with me longer than any declaration could have because it framed love as patience rather than pursuit. When we parted that night, there was no promise exchanged, just a quiet understanding that the story was still unfolding slowly, carefully. And as I walked home alone under streetlights that flickered like hesitant thoughts, I realized separation had stripped everything unnecessary away, leaving only the question that mattered. Not who I was meant to be with, but who I was willing to be when no one was watching. That night, I did not cry, not because I was strong, but because clarity had finally arrived, and it asked me to wait, to listen, and to trust that whatever came next would be chosen freely, honestly, and without fear disguised discomfort ever again. Soon. Is waiting sometimes the bravest form of love? The next few weeks felt suspended between intention and hesitation, as if life itself had slowed to give me room to decide who I was becoming now that my roles had been stripped away. And every morning I woke up without answering to anyone else's expectations, which was both terrifying and quietly powerful. He and I began exchanging messages that were careful and kind and free of urgency. Not confessions, but observations. Notes about books we were reading. Memories resurfacing without bitterness. And slowly those messages became a place where honesty felt safer than performance. One night I admitted something I'd never said out loud. That the wrong name at the altar had not been a mistake of memory, but a moment where my mouth spoke before my fear could intervene. And typing that felt like stepping into cold water knowing there was no turning back. His reply did not come immediately, and the waiting brought back every doubt I had ever carried. But when it arrived, it was simple and devastatingly gentle. He said he had always known, and that loving me had meant allowing me the space to arrive at truth without being claimed. We decided to meet again not as friends or almost lovers, but as two people willing to speak plainly, choosing a quiet cafe far from familiar eyes. And when I saw him sitting there, calm and open, I realized how rare it was to be seen without expectation. We talked for hours about our history and the invisible lines we'd never crossed, about loyalty mistaken for love and fear mistaken for commitment, and with every word spoken, something loosened inside me like a knot, finally trusting release. I told him I was afraid of rewriting the past, of hurting people unintentionally, of being judged for choosing late what others chose early, and he told me that timing did not diminish truth. It only tested its endurance. When we stood to leave, there was no dramatic moment, no sudden kiss or promise of forever, just an agreement to move forward slowly with intention, knowing that love built on clarity stands stronger than love rushed by longing. That night, alone in my apartment, I reflected on how easily life can be shaped by silence, how many paths remain unexplored simply because we fear the consequences of speaking, and I wondered how many other people had lived entire lives never realizing the courage it takes to name what you feel. I did not feel triumphant or redeemed, only honest, and honesty felt like enough for now, because it carried responsibility and freedom in equal measure, and for the first time since the wedding, I slept without replaying the past. The future remained uncertain, but it no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a conversation waiting to be continued, and I knew that whatever unfolded next would not be accidental, it would be chosen deliberately and with awareness, which made all the difference. Is love about timing or about the courage to finally speak? The consequences arrived quietly, not as confrontations, but as ripples, conversations with family that required patience, friends who needed reassurance, and moments where I saw disappointment flicker before acceptance settled in. And I learned that owning your truth does not spare others from pain, but it allows healing to begin without deception. My former husband and I met one final time to close the chapter with intention, and we spoke honestly about what we had been to each other and what we never could be. And in that space, there was grief, but also relief, because clarity freed us both from pretending we were something we were not. Walking away from that meeting, I felt lighter, not because the past no longer mattered, but because it had finally been understood, and understanding carries a weight that is easier to hold than regret. He and I continued forward carefully, still without labels, spending time together in ordinary ways that felt extraordinary, simply because nothing was hidden anymore. Cooking meals, taking long walks, sitting in silence without needing to fill it, and every shared moment reinforced the quiet certainty that this connection had survived years of restraint for a reason. There were days I questioned myself, wondering if I had simply traded one comfort for another, but those doubts dissolved in moments of truth, when conversations did not require editing, when laughter felt unforced, when being myself did not feel like a risk. I realized love does not always announce itself with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives as recognition, a steady presence that feels familiar, not because it is easy, but because it is honest. One evening he asked me if I was afraid, and I answered yes without hesitation. Afraid of repeating mistakes, afraid of being judged, afraid of losing something precious by finally embracing it. And he listened without trying to fix or reassure, which felt like the greatest kindness. That night, we acknowledged what we were becoming, without rushing into promises, understanding that love chosen consciously carries responsibility, and responsibility makes commitment meaningful rather than obligatory. As weeks passed, the world adjusted to our truth, whispers faded, explanations became unnecessary, and what remained was a life that felt aligned rather than performed, and alignment brought peace, even on uncertain days. I often thought back to the altar moment, not with shame, but with gratitude, because that slip of the tongue had been a fracture through which honesty eventually entered, and without it, I might have lived comfortably misaligned forever. Standing on my balcony one quiet morning, watching the city wake up, I understood that happiness is not about perfect beginnings or clean transitions. It is about choosing authenticity even when it disrupts the narrative others expect of you. I was no longer defined by the mistake or the delay, only by the decision to live honestly from this point forward, and that felt like the truest vow I had ever made. Can truth justify the pain it causes, or does love require accepting both? The ending did not arrive as a dramatic turning point, but as a gradual settling, like dust after a long storm, and one morning I realized I was no longer bracing myself for judgment or replaying decisions. I was simply living inside the truth I had chosen. We never announced our relationship with grand statements or explanations, because what mattered had already been said privately, and love that grows after clarity does not need witnesses to feel real. There were still difficult moments, anniversaries that stirred memories, questions that resurfaced unexpectedly, but instead of running from them, I faced them openly, learning that courage is not loud, it is consistent. One evening, months later, we attended a small gathering together for the first time, standing side by side without labels but with certainty, and I felt no guilt, only gratitude for how gently life had allowed us to arrive here after so many pauses. He asked me once if I regretted the timing, and I thought about it carefully before answering, because regret implies a different choice should have been made, and I realized every delay had taught me something essential about myself, about fear, about loyalty, about how easily love can be buried beneath obligation. What I regretted was not waiting, but not listening sooner, not trusting that honesty could coexist with kindness, and not believing that choosing yourself does not always mean abandoning others. On a quiet night, we spoke about the future, not in terms of marriage or permanence, but in intentions, promising to remain honest, even when it felt uncomfortable, to question ourselves before questioning each other, and to never let fear make decisions on our behalf again. That promise felt stronger than any vow spoken under pressure, because it was made without an audience and without expectation. Sometimes I think about the girl I was standing at the altar, trembling under the weight of certainty she did not possess, and I no longer judge her. I thank her for accidentally opening the door she was too afraid to walk through intentionally. Life did not punish me for that mistake. It challenged me to grow into someone capable of handling truth with care. Love did not rescue me. It met me when I was finally willing to be seen fully, and that made all the difference. If there's one thing I learned, it is this: love does not demand perfection, it demands presence, and the willingness to choose again every day without hiding. I did not end up with the wrong groom or the right one, I ended up with myself first. And from that place, everything else finally made sense. Some stories begin with certainty, others begin with confusion, but the ones worth telling are the ones that end with honesty, even if it takes a long way around to get there. Do you believe the heart knows the truth before the mind is ready to accept it?